everybody. My name is Richard Evans. Welcome to our August AskTom Database Security Office Hours. I'm joined here by my colleague and friend, Alan Williams, who's going to give you the presentation on multi-cloud security that he's done. So this call is being recorded. We'll post it at asktom.oracle.com. You can get to that a little bit easier through our bit.ly link, bit.ly/AskTomDBSec. And that'll take you to all of our sessions. We've got over 3 years worth of sessions out there now on every topic under the sun related to database security. So there isn't a subject that we've covered and you want to see a recording of it, yeah, please let me know. I'll drop my email in the chat here. You can send me an email and say, hey, I really want to see this presentation. I want to know what's going on with this technology. If you haven't joined us before, thanks for joining us. This is a direct channel into database security product development. So every month we do a session, we provide some announcements, we do a technical topic, we have question and answers at the end as well. So if you have questions, go ahead and put them in that question and answer section of Zoom, and we'll get to those at the end of the presentation. So again, your questions don't have to be about Alan's presentation. If you have another question, you're welcome to ask that. And if you don't feel comfortable asking the question in chat, then you're welcome to email me, and I'll provide my email in the chat here. All right, so let's go ahead and get started with some announcements. Patching. Everybody loves patching. So we released the quarterly patch back on 19 July. Security, bug fixes, some minor updates, some things in there. So always try to stay on top of these patches for all your products as much as possible. So for patch numbers and details, check out the My Oracle support note 2118136.2. You can also go to oracle.com/security-alerts for information on that patching. Okay, so if you are patching a dozen databases, 100 databases, 10,000 databases, take a look at Oracle Fleet Patching and Provisioning for your Oracle Home and your grid infrastructure deployment. So with that, you can do maintenance, out-of-place patching. So there's lots of really good ways for you to minimize the downtime and the impact of patching. So check out Oracle Fleet Patching and Provisioning as one of those tools. Another announcement here is DataSafe has some additional OCI events and notifications. So jobs related to masking or sensitive data discovery can take a long time on large databases. So it's important that we maybe get events and notifications based off of this. So there's some new events related to data masking and sensitive data discovery that you can receive events and notifications off of. A product update here for Oracle Data Guard redo encryption for a hybrid disaster recovery. So this is really neat, okay? In 19C 19.16, so that July patch set, we're changing the initialization parameter from encrypt new table spaces to table space encryption. So if you are currently running in a hybrid type of configuration and you're going to 1916, go ahead and open up a proactive SR before you do that upgrade, okay? Because before this wasn't a certified configuration. Now it will be, okay? So there's lots of neat things we can do here. We want to get customers that are not encrypting on-prem but are moving toward the cloud to ensure that they do that encryption in the cloud. And you've got some capability there to do that encryption on-prem for about a year as well with a included license, okay? Again, if you're encrypting data at rest, data in motion on one system, you should encrypt it on all systems that have that data. Any database that has production data is a production database, whether you call it test or dev or QA. If it has production data, it's a production database. So take advantage of the encryption that's available with transparent data encryption. Okay, and I'll post a link to this guide, this data guard redo decryption for hybrid disaster recovery configurations in the chat as well. All right, so Alan's going to cover some of the documentation. So in this topic today, he and the documentation team have done a fantastic job at keeping the security guide up to date with what's new with Oracle Database Security in 19C, as well as having a dedicated chapter for authentication and authorization for IAM users on our Oracle Autonomous Database. Okay, so take a look at the 19C security guide for updates, as well as a dedicated chapter on this topic. We've also got some blogs out there too. Okay, so take a look at blogs.oracle.com/cloud security. We've got some out there on non-extractable keys, upgrading to ADB-F, autonomous database, as well as the certification of unified auditing with EBS 12.2. Okay, so lots of neat things we've put out there on the blog. I shared a link in the chat that's to our GitHub repository where I list all these links for you. So hopefully that's something you can either copy and paste into a document, or you can mark down real quick. So I try to keep it pretty short for you. There's a live lab out there as well. It's really neat. Hakeem has released this live lab, Story of a Hack, where you kind of simulate attack and defense strategies, where an attacker is trying to exfiltrate some sensitive data and you're trying to prevent, detect, and mitigate those threats. So check out live labs. Lots of labs out there, lots of security-related labs, as well as this new Story of a Hack database security live lab. All right, and join us in October for Oracle Cloud World. You're going to be able to get hands-on with live labs. So that Story of a Hack lab is going to run twice. There's an autonomous database vault lab that's going to run a couple times, as well as an Oracle Data Safe lab that's going to run. So there's at least 14 security related presentation by product managers, development, customers. So we're going to be there at the booth. You can stop by and say hi to Alan, and the catalog is live. So you can go to oracle.com/cloud world and then click on contents, click on Oracle Database, and then view the database sessions and see what's out there. So we've got a lot of database security related topics that are available to you at Oracle Cloud World in Las Vegas, October 16th through 20th. And that's it for me. Let's get over to the good part of the presentation here. So Alan, I'll stop my sharing and let you take over.
All right. So welcome. Thank you very much for joining us in this session. And we're talking about how Oracle Database, right now, the autonomous databases can connect with Azure AD for authentication authorization of users. Now, this is the standard safe harbor. I may drop some hints about what's coming in the near and midterm future. Those are obviously not guaranteed, and we're just making sure that we have this safe harbor in here for that. So here's we've talked about a number of different ways to manage users centrally, with OID, OUD, so enterprise user security, and then on premises with Active Directory using centrally managed users. And earlier this year, we announced the integration with OCI IAM. That's our identity provider in the OCI cloud. And in a similar fashion, Azure AD can now be used as central management for users. So we've got the same benefits you get like with the other ones, like it's a centralized user management. So folks joining an organization can just be managed within the identity provider. Don't have to create new accounts for every single user that needs it in every database. Movers, people that move within an organization, need different privileges and roles that can be managed within, again, the central identity. And leavers, people, this is a key one, right? People that leave the organization, you don't have to try to hunt down and find all the accounts they've left if they're exclusively mapped or on any and all their IT resources. You also can benefit from the centralized account policies. You have like a centralized lockout for if you're doing 5 bad logins, it'll lock you out, and it'll lock you out from everything, right? If you don't have the centralized management, you can try 5 tries on every different resource. Separation of duties. You've got the DBAs that can focus on DBA type stuff instead of having to reset passwords for folks, and identity management that can work on managing the authorization and authentication information for the users. Plus, it's easier for users, right? They don't have to remember multiple credentials. They just have to have that single sign-on and remember that one. So that's the usual stuff you get with the centralized management, but there's some cool stuff you get with cloud that's not readily apparent, but that's what I want to focus on a little bit before we jump into the demo. On-premise directory services, you can use it for users and applications. Generally, what we see is most folks use it for their users and not for their application. Applications usually use local database, database username and password. But if you do that, then you've got that password that requires a periodic password rotations. Now, granted, we made that easier with the gradual password rollover, but you still have to manage that. A cloud identity, the neat thing is that it's designed for the users and applications. So cloud apps can, depending on the environment, they call them different things, but they have their own identity. Right? In the Azure world, that's managed identities. In the OCI world, they'll have principles like instance principles or resource principles. And in non-cloud apps, in the Azure case, right, can also have credentials. So that's some pretty cool things that you can do with these this cloud environment. You can also do user identity propagation a lot easier. In fact, it's definitely possible. In the past, it was in most cases impossible. Now you can have applications that use their database app accounts. They have to build that to account for every user, and including the roles and privileges needed to create and maintain those accounts with the database. So those are highly privileged accounts, and you have to protect them very carefully. What we could do with the cloud identity is when the user logs into the application with a token, the application can get what's called an on behalf of token for that user and pass that on to the database. So the connection to the database will be based on the roles and privileges of the user, not the entire application. So that's a nice way to control the access to the database and not have to have this huge app account for that. And then with this cloud, multi-cloud world, we have to be able to allow you to connect in different ways. If you're an Azure AD company and you have all your users in there, how do you access OCI services in the Oracle Cloud? Or how does the Azure AD services access the OCI database? I see a lot of folks copying data back and forth just so that they can make this work in their multi-environment world, because a lot of times the applications are on OCI, and so they're using databases in the OCI world. So you've got a couple options. You got the federation, which allows Azure AD users to access OCI services. You federate to IAM, and then you could act as an IAM user within the OCI world. But with this new multi-cloud, with this new Azure AD integration, you can also have an Azure AD user using an Azure application, and that Azure application only knows how to work with Azure tokens. And then if they can send an Azure token, they can connect with the database. So it's depending on the environment, you can do different things. So what do we have today? Well, we have what we talked about earlier this year, the OCI IAM integration. We have two different types. The first is just the regular username password you've seen with CMU as well, with Active Directory, where the users sends the username as a username password, and then the database will get the password verifier from OCI IAM, and just do the regular login. And the cool thing with that is you can use your existing database clients without having to update them. We can also do tokens from OCI to access databases. And I got a little asterisk there saying autonomous database currently, other platforms are being added. So this is one of the future type things. We're working on that. I'm doing some doc reviews, so hopefully that's going to be happening soon. Azure AD Federation with OCI IAM, that's with the new IAM, right? The IAM with identity domains. And folks have created tenancies, OCI tenancies since November. You have this new domain. Folks that have tenancies from before that, you have the older legacy IAM, and that'll be migrated to this new IAM with identity domains in the near future. So that's what's available on the IAM side. On the Azure AD side, you can now the user can authenticate on the client side, send a token, supporting Autonomous Database now. I'll be adding XSCS and Oracle Database. So this will, while there's other platforms we're not mentioning, it can work. It's just we're not going to have any supported things, documented things for that. Which one you use? Well, it depends on your use case. If you got legacy applications, you got it uses database username passwords, and you store them in a SEPS wallet. You just use the OCI IAM mechanism. Then there's very little change other than the username password that you do for that. And the neat thing with IAM is that it also has a way to do add a second password for gradual password rollover. So that's supported with that. If you're need access to the OCI service stack, like services that talk to the database, then you want to use IAM, the OCI IAM, or federated Azure AD user. If you got Azure services, this particular use case, then you want to use the Azure token to access the database. And if you're doing SQL Plus, SQL CL, that type of thing, you can use either one, depending on where you've been set up. Do you have Azure AD account? And you can use that directly, or do you have federation? If you're federated to the OCI, then you can use the IAM token. So here's this is the actual flow I'm gonna demo. We support 4 different flows with Azure AD. Client credential, which is the client app, where the application connects to the database as the application. The Auth Z flow, which I'm showing here, is the kind of the classic OAuth 2 flow, where the user will access the application. The apps will request an authorization code. The Azure AD will pop up a browser windows to have the user authenticate. It may have multi-factor authentication with that. And then you use that Auth Z code to request the token to access the resource, in this case, the Oracle database. It's an access token, so it's specific for the database, and it has the app roles that are associated for the user to the database. And the database has to make sure that this token is from Azure AD, so it'll do if it doesn't have the public key already, it'll get the public key and validate the token. Platform support. This is all new stuff, so it's a little bit hodgepodge with what's available. IAM database password is supported on all existing clients. It's just and I got the asterisks for the things that are coming down the road. IAM token, and note on the top left, database 19C, not 21C. And we backported 19C. It's not backported 21C. It's not it's no definite plans to backport to 21C at this point. It'll obviously be available in 23C. It may or may not ever be available in 21C. And then you'll notice an Oracle database for IAM tokens and password, you're not going to support it on an on-premise database. Azure AD token, available on ADB-D, autonomous databases, and in the near future on XSCS, and available on Oracle database. I'm not saying no to these blank spots here, but you'll have to do your own kind of network checks to figure out how to make that work. Client compatibility, again, if you're using IAM database password verifier, all supported versions, because it's going to connect to the database just like before. It's going to do the normal password logon process, so there's no big change there. If you're using tokens, either IAM or Azure, just get the latest the drivers. Now, there's 1915, 1916. Just get the 1916 one. It's got all the latest bits. And that should be available within the next, hopefully, few weeks from the download sites. Again, 21 database clients, 21. They'll have some features for this. They may not have all of it. I stick with the 19 clients for this, and then hopefully in the 23, 23.1 or so, we should try, hopefully have that in there as well. So here's what I'm going to show you in the demo. There's a number of steps I want to kind of describe it before we just jump right into the demo. First thing we got to do is for the database, we have to register it with Azure AD, because we have to accept permissions for the database, so that when a client requests access to it, we need to set up the database in there so it knows it can request permission for something. And when we did the database registration, we need to add a scope, that's the permission, and then app roles, and that's the authorization for users and applications. There's some things, a metadata that comes out when you create this app registration. We'll need to take a note of that. I'll point that out when we're doing the demo, and you need that when you're doing the registration for the database and the clients. A little bit different model if you're familiar with global users in the past, mapping to Active Directory and things like that. It's a little bit different here. We're using an extension of OAuth 2 that Azure AD provides called app roles. And so users, Azure AD users and groups can be assigned to app roles, and app roles are then mapped to either global schema or a global role. You can also do an exclusive mapping of the user, Azure AD user, directly to a global user. And anything, these app roles come in the token, so we don't have to do a separate lookup for that. All right, so here's the, after you set up the database registration with the app roles, you then assign users and groups to these, to this app registration, except it's actually the enterprise app. They have two things that are called, one's called an app registration in Azure AD, and the other one's an enterprise application. Enterprise application keeps track of the assigned users and groups. And there's a matching one of the enterprise application in every tenancy in Azure that database resource or other resource is allowed to use. Once you do that, then you go into the database and you enable the Azure AD integration and to provide some endpoint information. And so for ADB-S, they have their own unique way of doing it. They basically try to make it simple. For non-ADB-S, you have two alter system commands, and those will be in the documentation, hopefully in a few weeks. In autonomous database, they wrap that into a single enable external authentication, and that's in the documentation currently. Basically, setting the Azure AD, and then you got tenant ID, application ID, URI. Those are things that you get when you register your database with Azure AD. So then once you enable the database for integration with Azure AD, then you got to set up these global schemas and global roles that map to the app roles or exclusive mapping to an Azure AD user. So create user, identify globally, that's just like before, as Azure role equals DB users. That's the app roles that we talked about. And same thing here with the global roles mapping to an app role. All right, so that's the database registration with Azure AD and the database enablement, integration, and also this mapping of schemas. Now we jump off the client side. The client also has to register with Azure AD because the client has to actually get the token. So the Azure AD has to know who the client is and what kind of permissions they have. Then the database client has to also recognize that, oh, I've got to get a token. You can pass tokens through the API into the database client, like OCI, JDBC Thin, and the ODP clients will be able to accept Azure AD tokens. Or if the application can't send those Azure AD can't get or send those tokens to the API, you can have helper apps, utilities to get the tokens, put them in a file system, and then you do a /login with SQL Plus or other clients. It'll know that, oh, it's token auth equals OAuth. I've got to use token authentication, and the token is at token location. Azure AD has no default token location, so it has to be specified. All right, so that's configuration. There's a bunch of steps in configuration. What you want to do after you do that is, user, you've got to get this token. It's not, SQL Plus doesn't know about anything about getting these tokens, so you have to have a separate little script that runs to get the token. It could be a REST if you're using the resource owner password credential flow, or it's a Python script to execute the auth Z flow. But you'll get a token, and there's different ways to do that. And there's lots of different things. You can Google it up to find how to get tokens from Azure AD. And then SQL Plus, use a / and a connect string. You can configure the connect string ahead of time. I'm going to show you, I'm going to have you put the connect string as part of the login so you can see what I've done with that. Now, wouldn't it be nice if we can combine these two? Part of the safe harbor thing. I'd love to get the drivers to be able to get the stuff for the user so the user doesn't have to do it separately. But that's future stuff. I'm hoping we can get that done. All right, demo time. Let's get this cranked up. So I'm just signing into the my OCI account, so you can see I have the autonomous database, and I'm going to use the Azure DB demo that I created for this AskTom. And so that's it. This is the only OCI screen you're going to see. The rest is all going to be in the Azure portal. So in Azure, you go to Azure Active Directory, and you go into app registration, and you want to register a new app with this. And we're going to call it, and the only thing we have to specify for the database is the name. Now you got to figure out, is this going to be single tenancy, multi-tenancy, guess and things. So this is going to be single tenancy. No need to set a redirect URI, and then you register. So the initial registration is done, but you still have to set the permission for the database. And to do that, you need to set an app ID URI. So you want to set the app ID URI, and they have the set button here. Now they already pre-fill it with the app ID, so I just have to put the my tenancy domain name in there. It has to start with an HTTPS, and that's the app ID at the end. So I'll save that, and then I add a scope. This is a permission. You need to set it, and you'll see why I need this in the later on when I do the client registration. The client registration needs to ask permission, and this is what the scope allows you to have. This scope name, it can be anything. This is probably overly complex. if you're connecting, you need to have some text sometimes pop up on saying, hey, do you consent to this access? And so that's what this enables you to do. All right, so we have the scope. So now we have the scope. I need to copy this. I'll need that in the future. So I've got a text file open on a separate screen. I'm copying this into. And I also need the app ID, do that, and the app ID URI. So now we've done registering the database. We set up a scope. Next thing we got to do is create app roles. This is specific for the database. These are the app roles that'll help the user and application authorization. The first one, the way we're going to do this is all users that access this database is going to land in the same schema, the same shared schema. I call it the app role PB users, the users and groups. And so this will be mapped to a shared schema in the database, and we'll see that a little bit later. But I'm a DBA. I should have more privileges than the average person in here. So I'm going to also assign, there's another app role that's going to be assigned to a global role for DBAs. And just to show, we're not going to use this particular one, but like an HR app that needs to access the database, they can have its own app role. So now we've got scope, the registered database, added the scope, added the app roles. Now we have to assign users and groups. Remember, the app registration doesn't track the users and groups that are assigned to it. It's a mere app in enterprise app. So you see, we are in app registration. Now we're going to go into enterprise apps. When I create that app registration, it actually also created an enterprise app with the same name. And this tracks, and if you use the same resources database or in multiple tenancies, you're not going to create multiple app registrations. You're just going to have one app registration, but you'll have an enterprise application footprint in every single tenancy. There's much better YouTube videos that explain the difference than I can do in this 2-minute period. So you can Google that to kind of figure out the difference between enterprise app and app registrations. So here we're just adding users. I'm just going to pick myself. And remember, I need to be able to access a schema in the database. So that's the mapping I'm going to have to the PDB users. Actually, the assignment here, the mapping comes up next. I'm also going to want to have a DBA global role. So I want to pick the DBA role as well. And there. Okay. So now I'm done with the database registration, scope, app roles, and assigning users to database. I want to get into the database, and to do that, we'll spin up our PowerShell and get into the right directory. I don't want to type all this and bore you, so I've got everything on the second screen here. It's a clean database, so I got to go in as the admin account as an ADB shared infrastructure. So the system parameter identity provider type tells me if I'm connected to IAM, Azure AD, or none. In this case, it's none right now. So I want to, and as part of this, this is where I have to copy some things into my SQL. So this is the ADB-S command to enable Azure AD integration. And you can see it's this Azure AD will get pushed into the identity provider type, and this JSON object with tenant ID, application ID, and app ID URI. Those are things we got from the metadata when we registered the database with Azure AD. This I have to cut and paste in. And so be careful. This has to be accurate. Database is not going to check this stuff for you. So this has it's just a string value for the database. Now I'll take a look at make sure at least the Azure AD parameters push the identity provider type, and that's and the value is there. All right, now we've enabled the database for Azure AD integration. Now we need to map the users, create the users, map the users to the app roles. So here's that all users shared schema. It's identified globally as the Azure role. That's the app role. Remember that we create pdb.users. That's what I'm assigned to. And so that's where the mapping comes in. So when I log in the database, it's going to say, oh, I've got PDB users. That maps to all users. And that's the shared schema I'll land in. Now, if you're using HR app, there's that mapping there. And remember, I'm also got a global role that I need to be granted to me. And that's through the DBA.role. That's another app role I'm assigned to. That's a global role. All right, and next, just gonna do 3 of the commands at once, just the basic create sessions to the schemas, and I'm gonna get PDB DBA to the DBA Azure. That's the global role for the DBA. So that's done. I'm done with the database configuration. On to the client side. Okay, so the server, I registered it with Azure AD. I went to the database to configure the database. The client also has to be registered with Azure AD because it has to get the token. I'm going to go back into app registrations, create another registration. This one for the client side. I'm going to keep it single directory. Now this one is going to be a public client. Like if this is kind of the SQL Plus use case, you've got a bunch of people that are accessing the database using SQL Plus. You don't need all of them to create their own client. So you can have a public one, so you just have a client ID you deal with. Otherwise, you need a secret. And if you're passing around a secret to a bunch of people, it's not really a secret. So this is obviously more for intra-net usage or intra-company. Now, because I'm doing the Alt-Z flow, which requires a redirect, I have to redirect to my local host. And that's what I need to register the client application. Now, the client application is registered. In IAM, you have policies to allow users to access databases in a tenancy. Here, we do it through the client permissions. So I have to request permission to an API for this particular client, and I need to look at my APIs. And here's the database registration I created. This is for the user, so it's a delegated permissions. And remember, this is the scope I created. This is the permission. And I said this is setting the permission for the client to access it. So that's why we need to register the database so we can have a scope, so we can have permission to get an access token. All right. And then if you don't want to have the consent screen pop up, you can grant consent screen, grant consent ahead of time. Oh, and then go back to the overview. I do need this app client ID. Now we're done with the app registration for the client. Now we're going to try to get a token. And this is an Alt-Z token, which requires that 2-step thing. There's a great Microsoft article on getting Azure AD tokens by using the Microsoft Authentication Library. And the reason I want to use the library is because it's easier than doing multiple REST calls and doing cut and paste the Alt-Z code in between. And this page actually shows you how to do that. You're doing the multiple REST calls, how to set things up. This is great. Now, this is just for Databricks, but this is perfect, exactly what we're the use case that we need this for. So you can follow along. Now they show you the REST using REST to do this, but I just want to use the Python library because it's just a lot easier. I don't have to do the 2-step process, and they give you the Python code to do this. And so what I did is I copy and paste it, and you have to put information like the tenancy information is already in here. This client ID is the client ID of the client, not the database, because this is what's requesting it. Now, there's a nice note here. Do not modify this variable. It represents the programming ID for the Azure Databricks. So we need to access the database, and we need the scope of the database to go in here. So this is what we had before. The link, I copied that earlier, and I'm just going to put that in here, and I'm going to save it. Okay, so now we should be all set. Oh, what I need to do is to check my notes, but I need to log out of here because if it tries to do an authentication for me, it sees I'm already logged in here, so it'll bypass that. So I'm going to go ahead and log out. All right, back to there. Okay, so let's take a look. The get token.py, that's what I just modified, and you can see I just modified it a minute ago. And it's asking me to log in. Again, it works with the browser. You have other flows that don't require a proper browser, like the ROPC flow. So it all depends on what your use case is, what you need to support. For interactive users, this is most likely the one you want to do because it can also enforce MFA. Now, authentication complete, you can close this window. And let's take a look at the PowerShell again. And so I have it spit out on a screen. It also creates it as a file. You can see the token as a file inside here. Now, this is a JWT token. It's encoded, not encrypted. Now, there is a signature that's in here as well. But if you don't know, there's this cool jwt.io page, and you can put the encoded token in there and read what it's got. And it's got a signature part you can't read. Right? That's got to be You got to get the public key from Azure AD to verify it's from Azure AD. But the claims you need to look at, the odd field, and that's going to be the app ID URI of the database. That's why it's a scope. It's an access token for the database. If another Oracle database gets this, it's going to look at it and say, that's not me, and it'll reject it. So this will only be accepted by the database it's intended for. It's got some, the app ID is the client, the Python script I just ran, or the SQL Plus, the client side. There's my name information, the object ID, that's going to show up as an authenticated enterprise authentication in sys context. And the important thing, the roles, my roles, DBA role and PDB users, those app roles that I was assigned to shows up in this token. This token has everything I need to log in to access the database. Database doesn't have to make any additional queries. So this is actually pretty fast. It just gets token, checks it, does the mapping, and I'm in. So that's what you can look at from the token perspective. Let's go back to the PowerShell. Now, you can also, there's equivalent things you could do in Linux on Windows or Linux machines to get this access as well. Go into SQL Plus. I'm going to connect with the connect string, and I could have modified the connect string in SQLnet.aura or tnsnames.aura, but I just want to show it to you here. Now, direct connect string overrides any connect string in the TNS names, which will override anything in SQLnet.aura. So this is basically the connect string I got from ADB-S from the wallet. And you notice I added things in the security section, token auth equals OAuth. That tells the client to, if there's a /login, get the token from the token location, which is the where the token is stored. And I'm connected. Not that part's not exciting. Let's take a look at this, some of the sys context user end information. I'm just going to put them all in, and then we'll scroll through it. The first thing we did was we checked in the current user, and it's that shared schema all users because I was assigned to that app role. That app role was mapped to all users, and so when I logged in, that's where I landed in. Now I looked at select star from session roles. It's got the one I'm most interested in is a DBA Azure. That's that global role I was mapped to through my assignment through the app role. And the rest of it are just the roles you get from PDB admin. Now we'll go look at authenticated identity, and that's my username from Azure AD. And enterprise identity is that object ID, OID you saw in the token. That's my unique object ID in Azure AD. Authentication method is using token and global. And the reason it specifies token is if, like in IAM, I use the password verifier mechanism, then it will say password global. But I'm using the token global since I'm passing a token in. And the identification type is global shared. It could also be global exclusive if I was mapped exclusively to a schema in the database. All right, so that is the demo. Let's talk about what we did. All right, so the configuration steps, Azure AD, you register the database, you add the scope in the app roles, and then you got to assign the user to the app roles through the enterprise application side. And the database, you enable the database integration with Azure AD, and you map the database schema to app role. And in this case, we had a global role to differentiate the roles for the user. So we did map a global role to an app role. Client, create app registration, set the permission to get access tokens for the database. And now we didn't configure the database client for the token. I did that through the connect string in the operational step. But in operational steps, we got the token. I showed you one way to do it with Python, and then logged in with / and then the connect string. All right, so this gets you similar benefits as Azure AD integration. Gets you some similar benefits on premises direct integration, but you get to take advantage of multi-cloud stuff. So yes, you can connect cloud databases to on-premises directory services, but it's much better for cloud resources to connect and use cloud identities. And generally, we also see on-premise resources use on-premise directories. So I haven't seen a use case to cross boundaries, but it's possible with our Azure AD integration to do that. It's just I'd like to if you have it, I'd love to hear about it. So today you have this information with OCI AM Azure AD in the 19C database security guide. It's not in the 21C. Again, that database server does not support this. Watch the blogs for database security for upcoming information. I should have another one in another month and a half or so. And watch the database security guide. We keep updating information in the what's new and in the DBRU section, the what's new updates. And then we have a dedicated chapter for Azure AD integration and another dedicated chapter for IAM integration. And that's it. Fit it into the hour.
So next month, second Wednesday, AskTom event is going to be on the 14th of September. It's a little interesting because we kind of split the week with these events that we do. So our topic for next month's AskTom event is going to be an introduction to the updates and new features in Audit Vault 20.8 that Nazia is going to come on present. And she's going to talk about an AVDF reference architecture too. So different opportunities to install, to manage, to deploy Audit Vault and Database Firewall.